All right, aloha everyone. Welcome to our March general meeting for the Oahu Climate Reality Project chapter. Today we have Paul Bernstein, an analyst with the UHero program at UH, to share with us the the carbon pricing assessment for Hawaii. Is that the correct title?
That's close enough.
But yeah, we're so excited to have you. I know there's a lot of people who are interested in like market-based policies as a tool for really transformative change in getting to a cleaner, more sustainable future and energy landscape. And so without further ado, I'll hand it off to you. And then maybe afterwards, we can have time for Q&A and discussions.
Sure. So I'll just try and take about 30 minutes or so for the slides, but obviously please interrupt me at any point in the presentation. No fun just listening to myself talk. And afterwards, happy to, Q&A, what have you. So I assume I can share my screen.
Let me just confirm that. Are you able to? Can you try?
Yeah, looks like I can.
Okay, awesome.
And actually, I'm going to turn off my video because I have my internet is rather unstable. So let me just do this. Okay, so thank you for the introduction, Sebastian. And yeah, carbon pricing assessment for Hawaii. So I'm going to basically talk about the UHero report, which, which I did along with McKenna Kaufman, who was the lead and is a professor at the University of Hawaii associated with UHero and a couple other departments. Also did this with Maya Sheverheim, Sherilyn Hayashida, and Sumner LaCroix. So the five of us were asked to do this study. Basically came out of Act 122, which the Hawaii legislature allocated $150,000 to be spent on a study to assess the economic impacts of Hawaii implementing its own carbon tax. And as part of the study, they wanted to look at they wanted to look at essentially two different scenarios. One is a low carbon tax level close to the social cost of carbon under the Obama administration, and then a high carbon tax level to look at what it might take to for Hawaii to meet its 2045 goal of being net carbon neutral. So the model that we employed for this falls in the category of a computable general equilibrium model, which basically it's a model that accounts for all the financial flows in the economy. And the model is just basically looking at Hawaii. It does have a connection to the outside world in terms of trade and imports and exports, and also has a visitor sector, since that's obviously quite important to Hawaii's economy. The model is built upon DBED's input-output matrix, which is just showing the flows, the economic flows for Hawaii's economy. So, for example, in a particular sector like ag, it's saying how much of each input ag takes to produce a dollar's worth of output from that sector. For the study, one of the things that the act required, or the legislature required, was to look at the distributional impacts across household types. So we expanded the data set to disaggregate the household into the one household in the database into 5 different households based on income level, or in other words, the 5 quintiles. So from lowest income to highest income. And this way we get a better sense of whether a policy is progressive or regressive. So in other words, how does it affect the lower income folks relative to the higher income folks? And as I said, that we had 2 carbon tax levels, but with each of the carbon tax levels, we looked at 2 different ways to recycle the carbon tax revenues. One was to give all the money back to the state and let the government kind of do what it will with it. And the other one was to take all the revenues except those for air transport and let those go back to citizens in equal shares. So no matter what your income level is, you would receive the same dividend, if you will. And I can talk more about this. So, whoops, sorry. So for the four scenarios, as I said, there were 2 carbon price levels, and there's a low tax and a high tax level that we considered. The policies start in 2025, and in the low tax case, we started with a $50 per metric ton of CO2, rising to $70 by 2045. For the high tax case, we looked at $240 as a starting price, rising to $1,000 by 2045. Now, just to ground this in numbers we deal with on a daily basis, so $50 a metric ton is about 45 cents a gallon of gasoline, and $1,000 is roughly $9 a gallon of gasoline. So quite the carbon price there on the high end. And to put it in context also, there were a number of bills in the recent legislative session that looked at making changes to the barrel tax. So just equating what a carbon tax is in terms of roughly a barrel tax for gasoline, the $50 is about $19 a barrel of gasoline. And the current barrel tax is $1.05. So this would be definitely a market increase in the barrel tax if it were implemented that way in Hawaii. Okay. So back to in terms of kind of the overall policy, and apologies, I'm just not sure how familiar everybody is with this. I know I'm hopefully not boring everybody here, but anyway, so the basics of the program are to place a tax or a fee on fossil fuels, so coal, oil, natural gas, and that money is collected by the state government. So remember, we're just looking at a state carbon price. We're assuming the rest of the world's not making any changes. And then we consider that the government can do 2 different things with it. It can either give this money back to individual citizens, so calling this a dividend, and what we assumed for the dividend, as I said, was it was going to go back in equal shares. And so since our model is looking at households, it said for each household, you get the same amount of money. So the high income households get the same amount of dividend payments as the low income households. The other option is that the money just circles back to the state government, and the state government kind of spends it in the same pattern that it expends money today. And this route here, going straight from the collecting the revenues and going straight to households, is what people commonly refer to as carbon fee and dividend going back to the households here. Okay, a few other assumptions we needed in running the model. We had to come up with a forecast for gross state product and forecast for the visitor sector in terms of visitor expenditures and visitor arrivals. Changing this forecast would change the numeric values that we get, but really wouldn't have a change in terms of the qualitative impacts that I'll talk about. So qualitatively, adjusted this GDP forecast, we would see the same type of results. The other thing is we assume that the RPS policy, the renewable portfolio standard that exists today, that is in statute, remains. And we're looking at the essentially effective renewable portfolio standard, even though it claims to be 100% based on its accounting. It only works out to be about effectively 72%, requiring that the electric utilities produce 72% of their electricity with renewables by 2045. And then one other assumption, a key assumption, is what we assumed about the share of electric vehicles in the economy over time. And so we tried to tie it to a publicly available forecast. And basically we split the difference between two. One was a HECO forecast and the other one was from the US Energy Information Agency. And the US Energy Information Agency is rather pessimistic. I believe forecasting something like around 8% of the vehicles on the road in 2045 would be electric, versus HECO is somewhere north of 50% of the vehicles would be electric in 2045. And this is on the road, right? Not new sales. It's actually what the fleet looks like. Okay, so on to the results here.
Hey, Paul?
Yes.
Yeah, there is a question in the chat. I wonder if it would be timely for us to address that before proceeding.
Sure.
Can you see it? Can you see the chat?
Oh, okay. Sorry, I'll bring it.
I'll read it to you. What were the
Okay.
reasons for choosing the specific low and high tax numbers? Is it based on specific bills? So what was the rationale for the spread, the low
Sure.
price and the high price?
Gotcha. Sorry, just trying to go. So the low price, the starting price was chosen to basically reflect the social cost of carbon under the Obama administration. So under Obama, there was intergovernmental working group that was tasked with finding the marginal damage from an additional ton of CO2 equivalent emitted. And their estimate, taking a few different models and averaging everything out, came to $50 a metric ton in 2025. And then sort of escalating to $70 by 2045. Now, the work that they did, oh gosh, I think it was basically 2014, somewhere around that time frame. And since then, the estimates for the damage from climate change have only increased. And so, though the Biden administration has restored the social cost of carbon value to something close to this, sorry, I should back up. So under the Trump administration, this value, they made a different set of assumptions and they came to a value that was about 1/10 of this. The Biden administration, I think it was last month, came out with new numbers, kind of a quick estimate, and they basically restored it to the Obama era numbers. And they're in front of this, I'm not sure exactly who's tasked with it. They are now going back and looking at the latest data on what the science is saying, and a new social cost of carbon number should come out in a year or so, which is almost assuredly to be higher than this. Sorry, long answer to your question, but anyways, the $50 is from Obama's social cost of carbon. The high price case was an attempt to get it, what would it cost, or what kind of a carbon price would be required if Hawaii wanted to be carbon neutral by 2045? And so we basically kind of show another curve later why we kind of settled on this. But basically, if you start getting prices much greater than $1,000, we find that there's really not much emission reductions after that, or it becomes very expensive to keep getting the next additional ton. So we basically stopped at $1,000. Also, $1,000 or this trajectory was enough to drive at least the electric sector to be zero carbon emitting. Does that answer the question? Much more than
Thanks,
anybody
Paul.
wanted to hear.
That was great, Paul. Thank you.
Okay, sure.
And sorry, May joined, and I just wanted to let I had to mute because there was a lot of background noise. So if you need to connect, just to unmute, please. Thank you.
And very helpful. Thank you.
Okay. Okay, so happy to take, as I said, please feel free to interrupt at any time. So for the results, so first we, just to get a sense of, for the baseline, we see that emissions are actually declining in the baseline for Hawaii, which is basically brought about by the renewable portfolio standard. So these emissions are coming, the drop in emissions are coming primarily from the electric sector, though there is some actually from the light duty vehicle sector, or at least it's kind of flattening because of our assumption about electric vehicles. So under the low carbon price scenario, the $70 a ton by 2045, we get an additional about 13% reduction by 2045. And somewhere in here, it's about a 10% reduction in emissions. If we go to the very high carbon price scenario, we get about a 70% or so, a little over 70, well, actually probably closer to 80% reduction in emissions from what the emissions would have been in the baseline here. So, or sorry, 70% reduction from there, and an 80% reduction or so from 2015 levels here. But so you can see there's still a, getting back to the, the reason of stopping at $1,000. So I should just clarify, it's not that the legislature or UHERO or anybody thought that $1,000 carbon price was something that the legislature was going to implement. Okay, so this was really just for the purposes of the study, just an economic analysis. So I just want to be clear before somebody has a takeaway that the legislature was considering $1,000 carbon tax. So that's not the case. Okay. So in terms of what these carbon prices, what we find these carbon prices mean to folks' energy bills and what it means for a dividend back to households in the scenarios where the revenues are returned to households. So the $50 to $70 is roughly, as we showed you earlier, just rounding to one significant digit here, 50 cents to 60 cents a gallon of gasoline. We find that electricity prices really don't increase. Gas prices, so this is propane or syngas here, would go up about $4 an MCF to $6 an MCF. So just to get a sense of what these numbers mean, roughly what we're paying now for synthetic natural gas is about $50 an MCF. So this is basically about a 10% increase in the price of gas. Now, in this low carbon price policy, it equates to about, if the dividends are given back to households, so all carbon tax revenues are given back to households except those collected from air travel. And that's because jet fuel, if you tax jet fuel, that those tax revenues have to go towards airport services. The government can't just use it, the state government can't just use it however it chooses. So anyway, so if the remainder of the revenues go back to the households, we find that the dividend to households is roughly about $100 a month. In the high tax case, is said when trying to equate these carbon taxes, it's about a $2 for a gallon of gasoline in 2025, up to $9 a gallon of gasoline. So quite significant. We find electricity prices would be about 8 cents higher in the near term. And so, well, actually, I should be careful. I'm not sure what, on Oahu, we're paying about 30 cents a kilowatt hour. I don't know, Noel, what you pay on the Big Island, but my guess is it's a fair bit more, actually.
Yeah, not really sure. We've got solar on the roof, so I haven't noticed, but it's a good question. I think it's a little bit more.
Right, okay. And then the price actually does not go up nearly as much in the long run, because by then we've converted all to renewables at that point. For the gas, it's gone up significantly more, similar to what we see in terms of gasoline here, in terms of kind of the multiple. And the dividend has also gone up more, because though we have lower emissions, the carbon price has gone up more than the emissions have gone down in the near term. So households would be getting about $380 a month in the near term. But as the emissions drop substantially, even though the carbon price is going up, households would get somewhere in the order of $230 a month in the long run. Okay, so one of the key things we want to get out of this study is, what is the impact on households? So we see that the energy prices, the price for energy goes up. So that affects them in a direct sense in terms of purchasing electricity, purchasing gasoline and propane or syngas on Oahu. And it also affects the price of the goods and services, since if you're eating out at a restaurant and they're using gas or electricity, that's going to end up driving up the price of, to prepare the food and what have you. So the price of goods and services, or non-energy goods and services, rise, as well as the energy goods. But as we said, if you're giving the money, in the case where you're giving money back to the households, there's an offsetting effect. You get this dividend. So question is, how does this kind of wash out in the end? So this figure and the next figure look at, try and get at that, or answer that question for 2040, 2025 and 2045. So first, looking at 2025, here we have the 5 household quintiles. And just to kind of get a sense of what the lowest quintile or the different quintiles represent, the average income for the lowest quintile is about $15,000. At the high end, the top 20%, their average household earning is about $190,000. So if we are I'm just going to concentrate also on the $70 cases. 1,000 are just, a bit, for the most part, just a bit more extreme. So if we do return the dividend to households, so this is this scenario here, the $70, the light purple. And this here is saying, what's the percentage change in their consumption or their welfare, but you can think of it just as their consumption relative to the baseline. We see that the lowest income households actually see around a 2% increase in their welfare or their consumption. And the second quintile about 1%, and it keeps dropping until the 5th quintile it's really a basically a wash for them. Contrast that with if the dividend just goes back to the government, we actually have a loss in welfare consumption for all households. And worse than that, the loss is worse on a percentage basis for the low income folks than it is for the high income folks. Whereas when we're looking at the case where the dividend goes back to households, we have the reverse. We have the low income folks are actually doing better off on a percentage basis than the high income folks. And they're actually doing better, I'm gonna move this here, on an absolute basis, in that when you give the dividend back to the households, you see that they're actually making the most amount of money, right? Or they're coming out the most positive at $930 annually for the low income households, as opposed to, near zero or $25. If the dividend goes back to the government, then low income households are losing by $250 a year. High income households are losing by $450. And just kind of gets more dramatic here if we're in the high income. So if we move to 2045 here, the impacts are not quite as great in terms of for the lowest income households in terms of the percentage increase, or here in terms of looking at it monetarily in terms of the net. So it was something like $900 in 2025, and now it's something like $700 in 2045. And here the higher income households end up doing a little bit better than they did in 2045 and in 2025. And that's probably predominantly a function of electric vehicles. So we have that forecast for the percentage of electric vehicles on the road, but what isn't kind of ingrained in the model, if you will, is the assumption that the higher income households are going to be able to afford the electric vehicles before the low income households. So there's a much higher penetration of electric vehicles in higher income households than in lower income households. So as they transition, the higher income households are putting less into the pot, if you will, than they were in 2025 when they didn't have as many EVs.
Hey, Paul,
Yes.
if it's okay. My hope and my wish and this influences the work that I do, my volunteer work with Hawaii EV, is that we will change that, right? As the price of the electric cars drift downward, and as the number of pre-owned electric cars, which are very affordable, increase, that it's going to be more of an awareness issue, letting people know that they can actually drive cleaner and cheaper if they shifted to electric vehicles. So I just wanted to kind of call that out.
Sure.
The one thing I wanted to I guess raise is that when we talk about these benefits, or what the economic impact is, it assumes that the households they maintain the current behavior, right? The current expenditures. No. So does it assume that people will shift to more energy efficient solutions, electric cars,
Yes.
appliances, and so on and so forth? It does.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. So the model, I guess could have gone more into the model structure, but just quickly, since you raised the question, in both the household sector and in the production sectors, in the business sectors, in all of them, there are there is the ability to substitute out of energy into capital, labor, and materials. And in the model, it's our assumed values of the elasticities that determine how easy or difficult that is. So certainly one could suggest that, well, could do a scenario analysis where you assume it's easier for households and businesses to move away from fossil fuels into, either substitute in from fossil fuels to electricity, or do other types of things, maybe use more labor, use different set of materials to displace energy, and it would make it less costly. You could also go the other way and say that consumers it's going to be really difficult to get them to change their behavior, and then it makes it more costly. But the model is allowing for substitution, and it's the prices that are driving that substitution. So when we get into the high tax case, we get a much bigger substitution, and that's what's driving down those emissions that we saw in the beginning, right? We're getting a much bigger emissions drop with the high carbon tax than we do with the low carbon tax. And that's all based on how households and businesses are responding to prices.
Paul, I have a quick question.
Sure.
If I'm understanding this graph correctly, am I correct in saying that like any amount above the baseline is generally good and anything below the baseline is generally bad?
Correct.
And if that's the case, I see that there's this, this idea that if we don't achieve carbon neutrality here and globally by whatever the date, 2050, or cut our carbon emissions by half by 2030, that the climate impacts will just be astronomical. So I'm curious what your opinion is, or what the consensus from the team is of to what degree I'm looking at the $1,000 with dividend is kind of in the negative, right? Like, is that an acceptable, I don't know, cost to welfare? Or is that like a deal breaker, and kind of that's the data shows that it's not like a sustainable market-based policy to implement this because it impacts welfare in this negative way? Does that question make sense?
Yes, I think so. I mean, I guess first I think implicit in your question is a very good point, that this modeling is only looking at the economic costs. It is not looking at the benefits that would come about if we reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Now, we could say for Hawaii, it doesn't matter at all what Hawaii does with greenhouse gas emissions. But suppose that this were a national carbon price, and these were, national numbers and hence international numbers. And then those reductions make, there's a huge difference, right? Whether we reduce by 80% or we only reduce by 10% or what have you, right? So important to remember that I just want to be clear that we are not accounting for the benefits, right? Both the climate change benefits, as well as we're not accounting for health benefits for ground level pollution too, by reducing the accompanying emissions that come with fossil fuels. Now, to your point about, is a welfare loss of that a deal breaker? I guess personally, I think there's going to have to be some kind of, measured in these terms of welfare loss. But again, the problem with this is we don't have the benefits in here. So, we're going to have some kind of negative in terms of the way we classically measure gross state product and economic well-being. But when we look at adding in the benefits here, that we're going to, that's going to lead us to a much lower either loss or possibly a gain in welfare if we go with the higher, the higher carbon price scenario. But again, we're not capturing that. Am I answering your question?
Yeah, I believe so. I guess another way to reiterate my question was like, yeah, it's kind of just like, is it a deal breaker that it's negative? But like, as you mentioned, since it doesn't fully account for those benefits, then maybe a more holistic view of the ramifications of a carbon tax could kind of balance itself out in terms of welfare. Um, uh, but then I'm also curious from like a policymaker's perspective, does a chart like this express like, oh, this high carbon tax scenario is unviable because it's in the negative and then it's discounted? Or is it just information and they'll use that information as it's relevant and weigh it with those benefits as it's outlined in another report or another study?
So I think, I mean, the business community previously, I mean, groups like API or what have you, it's easy for them to take a figure like this and to say, this is why we don't want a carbon price, that look at these welfare losses that we get. I guess, again, I go back to, if we don't do anything, the losses are going to be astronomical. I mean, if we were to take no action on climate change, at least unless the majority of scientists are absolutely wrong, right, we're going to have disastrous effects that are far more than these numbers. The just lost the what was I going to say? Oh, the other thought is I'm not sure if you're trying to compare this carbon price to other policies out there. And so if you want any policy, let's say you want to just mandate, the keep it in the ground scenario or what have you, or actually maybe that's not quite the best one. But if you want to mandate command and control regulations, what we usually find is they're actually going to be far more costly than this. And so, yeah, the price isn't out there and it's harder for people to, point to, because there's not a price in the market that they can say, hey, I don't like that price. I see the gasoline going up or what have you. But various command and control regulations will, at the end of the day, have to raise prices too. It won't be direct, and so then making it just that much more inefficient. And I guess while I'm on my soapbox, I'll also say that a big problem of the command and control regulations is often they're regressive. So whereas, yeah, this has got issues here and it's not as progressive as you might want it, but it's much better than often, if you look at the command and control regulations, are quite regressive. So they're more costly, less efficient generally, and more regressive. It's not the same for, it's not a blanket statement for all regulatory policies. I mean, some of them, we need because there are other market failures out there, like efficiency standards or what have you. But I guess just trying to argue against when people say that, oh, look, you put in the carbon tax and you get these kinds of losses. Well, we should just regulate everything. I don't think that's the right response.
Okay, thank you very much.
Sure. Probably much more than you wanted to hear. But anyways.
No, it's great insight into kind of the thinking in and around these figures is like.
Okay. Well, thanks for the question. Appreciate it. Okay, so in terms of what the dividends mean for the revenue to the state government, the revenues to the household. So this is the bottom part is just kind of expanding on what I showed as a graphic earlier on. And here is just to get a sense of the revenue that would be going back to the state under the different policies. So if the government returned revenues to households, except for the revenues for air, the Honolulu or the airports in the state could look really quite nice. They'd have an extra $80 million in 2025 to spend. Households would be getting about $1,000 a year. And this is fairly constant over the time horizon, the $70 case. In the $1,000 case, they would get $3,000 a year, going up in the near term because the price is basically going up faster than the emissions are coming down. But then towards the end, the emissions are coming down more than the price is going up. So there's a drop in the household dividend towards the end. And likewise, if in the higher price cases, oh, sorry, I misquoted. Sorry, with the dividend, the government would get 110 million. I thought the number was too high there. Sorry. If the money just went back to the state, all that went back, you can see that they could fill a lot of their budget gap here. Take 580 minus 110, they'd have close to, excuse me, $500 million that they would have, assuming they didn't give any of it back to households. And if, the higher price, there's more money for the government. Okay, in terms of kind of summary points, from the welfare charts, just to reiterate, if the dividend goes back to the households in equal shares, we find that the carbon tax policies are progressive. And in the low tax case, households win out over time too. So they both benefit from the policy, and the policy is progressive. Something that helps us in Hawaii is the fact that the visitors pay this carbon tax. So they're not going to get the dividends. It would only be the residents. So the visitors pay into this when they come here and they're purchasing goods and services. So that reduces the burden on locals. On the other hand, I mean, the visitors are contributing to the greenhouse gas emissions, so only fair that they pay. In terms of the emission reductions that we get out of the policy, as I mentioned in the beginning, with the low price one, the social cost of carbon, essentially policy, we see about a 13% reduction in 2045. And if we move to the, excuse me, there's a typo there. We move to the high income, sorry, the high tax case, we get about a 80% reduction from 2015 levels, or 70% reduction from the baseline. Oh, sorry, which is, sorry, looking at anyways, the wrong bullet here. So as I said, 80% from 2019 level. The issue too, though, at the high carbon price level, we start to see a significant contraction in Hawaii's economy. So at the high carbon price, now Hawaii goods are becoming far less competitive relative to the rest of the world. So under the assumption here, the rest of the world isn't doing anything while Hawaii businesses are facing in the end, $1,000 carbon price. So we're seeing a significant decline in exports and somewhat of a pickup in imports. So kind of, and in terms of the sectors that are hit the hardest, not surprisingly, the petroleum manufacturing or the refinery sector here, the gas sector, and the transportation sectors, which are more energy intensive. So with that, I'll stop for other questions.
Paul, I guess just a comment. It sounds like the opportunity, the opportunity is for Hawaii to establish something, right? A price in carbon, ideally with the dividend to mitigate the impact, the social impact. But then, and at the same time, be a beacon for the rest of the nation, right? Be sort of like a leader that creates a cascade of legislation across the nation, and perhaps a national carbon pricing strategy. Although we hope that that happens sooner than later. So there's that one piece, which is that if something like this were to happen, we wouldn't be going doing it on our own by ourselves, right? That there would be a national price, and then the rest of the globe would also follow suit. In fact, we're kind of laggards right behind the EU right now. So anyway, that was my key takeaway, is that yeah, there's some impact here, but we wouldn't go really high to begin with. The strategy is to start low and gradually increase over time. And during that time frame, you would have other, you would have a national price, and you would have, global participation as well.
I completely agree. And what we need is the national and the global participation, right? We're going to tackle this problem. It's not going to help if Hawaii's the only actor. And also I will say, hopefully we do get a global program. And in that case, then some of these trade issues would, or most of them would basically go away, because then everybody's facing the same price increases, right? Or the same restrictions on using fossil fuels, however that may come about.
Leon, you have a question about reaction. I'll just state something, and Paul, feel free as well. This session we had 4 pricing bills, and they all didn't make it all the way through, but we had 4. In the previous session we had 1, and then on the national stage we have prominent Republicans who are also now talking and supporting carbon pricing, right? I think Mitt Romney was the last person that I heard. So there is, if we're talking, if the question is, what is the perception, or what is the the sentiment on carbon pricing? It's changing in a positive way. Just based on the examples that I just shared with you. Paul, can you also respond to Leon? Especially the public sentiment is an interesting one, which I'm not really familiar with. I have some assumptions, but do you have any take on that?
Well, for what polls or surveys for whatever the value is, I mean, it seems that there are a few different ones out there. There's the one from Yale and one from, I'm probably going to butcher his name or get it wrong, Luntz or something like that, who was a Republican pollster, and both find that carbon pricing is widely accepted, and even among Republicans, especially young Republicans. It, not surprisingly, garners, well, maybe it is actually today's climate, garners higher support among Democrats than it does among Republicans. But certainly it's well over 50% of the population is in favor, it seems, of carbon pricing.
I had 2 questions that are kind of interrelated. The first one is, if we started off with like a low carbon tax plan, how flexible would it be to be ramped up as needed? Like, could it start off as something more conservative based off of social cost of carbon metrics that are also expected to become more accurate and increase? but then be ramped up in a way that allows us to achieve those carbon neutrality goals in a timely fashion? Or is it sort of this like long-term commitment to a certain, I don't know, regime of growth, of ramping up those rates? I'm just not really familiar how like that process looks like and how flexible it would be to modification.
Well, I mean, as a lawmaker, you could, I think you're free to legislate however you want. You could make the carbon price dependent on emissions or what have you. And then part of the problem though with any legislation is every year it can be revisited, right? So it could change. I guess a couple of things I would say. One is there was a bill before in the National Congress, basically carbon fee and dividend, the Energy Innovation Carbon Dividend Act. And in that, the carbon price could increase by $10 or $15 per year, depending on the level of emissions. So in that bill, there is some flexibility in what the carbon price could be. I think it's important that you try, at least for a block of time or in blocks of time, try not to have the carbon price vary too much. Because one of the arguments for having a carbon price versus a cap and trade, where you cap the emissions and you allow allowance trading or trading of permits, is that the carbon price gives the business community and households a known price trajectory on which to base their business decisions or household decisions. And if you're going to just vary that price wildly from year to year, then it makes it hard for people to plan. So I think, some flexibility is needed, because if the carbon price is not bringing about the level of emission reductions that you need, then it has to go up, right? Something has to be done. But as I said, I think you have to be somewhat careful not to, so maybe you kind of have it fixed in a pretty narrow band for 5 years, right? And in 5 years, in year 2 or 3, you start reevaluating what the next 5 years are going to be, and do something like that. I don't know. I don't know if others have other suggestions, but that's, I guess, kind of what I hear.
I think that maybe just this is redundant, but just starting out low and then having a meaningful increase annually, and then having a point in the future whereby you can validate the impact, and if it's not doing what it's supposed to do, then to make an adjustment. And I think that was sort of like one of the key tenets of the bill, right? The Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act. So the gradual increase, in my view, and I think it's the the rationale for it, it allows for a transition period. It allows consumers and businesses, the industry, to adjust. It's not like the shock to the system. So there's this gradual transition, as the prices start to increase, and it allows for research and innovation to kind of like come up with more energy efficient, less carbon intensive processes that would be, in reaction to this imminent demand, right, from consumers, because they want to spend less. They want, they want to save money. So anyway, that's the rationale, I think, for having a gradually increasing, meaningful, but gradually increasing price. I put in the chat, Durbin, Senator Durbin recently introduced a carbon pricing bill. So it's called America's Clean Future Fund Act. And we're also expecting that our favorite bill to be reintroduced as well. This is obviously on the national side. Oh,
That does exist.
Leon, yeah, I was going to say that.
Go ahead, Noah.
You want to share the link? Do you have the link handy?
I don't have it handy, but
Let me see if I can find that real quick. So it's a calculator, right?
Yeah, the carbon calculator from CCL. Yeah.
Let me just find that and put it in the chat here real quick.
While you're looking at that, I just want to quickly mention that we're at 4 p.m. So I know some people need to go on to other things. So I just wanted to say thank you again very much, Paul, for sharing. We can keep the Zoom room open to keep the discussion, but for those of you who need to leave, you're welcome to now.
And
And
Sebastian, that includes me. I need to run to another meeting. What I'll do though is I'll make you the host, so the meeting doesn't end when I leave.
Okay.
And I did put the in the chat the link to the calculator.
Okay, wonderful.
Okay.
Thanks, Noel.
Thanks. Take care.
Take care.
Great job, Paul. Take care. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Wonderful. Did we have any more questions? I have a couple more if no one else has.
Guess it's all yours, Sebastian.
All right. So a lot of where my thinking goes is, what are the multifaceted approaches to solving the climate crisis? But in the same way, there is no golden bullet to solve these issues. What are mechanisms that are kind of, I don't know, irreplaceable, so to speak? So I guess my question is it possible, in your opinion, to achieve carbon neutrality without a market-based policy, such as a carbon tax? Like, is that even possible without some form of a carbon tax? And if so, what is an alternative? I'm not sure. Or if not, then to what degree can it still be kind of in this middle ground between that low and high case, but still be complemented by other solutions in order for us to get to where we need to go?
I don't think I don't see why you I'm kind of going against what I'm lobbying on my personal side, but I don't see, and maybe I'm looking at it wrong. I don't see why you have to have a carbon price. I mean, well, forgetting any political feasibility or what have you, right? I mean, you could dictate you can't drill anymore, you can't mine coal, you can't do this by a certain date. You can't, do whatever other activities, right? I mean, we're perfectly capable of writing laws that prohibit the activities that produce greenhouse gases. I mean, well, from the burning of fossil fuels, well, we could do some of the others too. We could say, well, no more making cement. I mean, it doesn't seem like a very good idea, but unless you can do it, you can capture all the carbon and, embody it in the cement. But so I don't see, from that sense, politically, it just seems that it would be hard, but I think any of this stuff is going to be hard politically because we're asking for massive changes in the economy and it's going to be expensive to people, and need to convince them that the alternative is going to be even more expensive. I mean, alternative meaning we don't do enough or what have you. I guess the way I see, I'm not sure if I'm quite answering your question here, that some of the other parts that in terms of what would be the best command and control regulations, let me just say that I agree with you that there's no silver bullet. And so I think what we could use is a carbon price, we could use efficiency standards, we could use investment in R&D. We need to figure out what to do with some of the other greenhouse gases, the high global warming potential gases. I mean, the Energy Innovation Carbon Dividend Act does place a fee on them, but I don't think it's necessarily as easy to control. So you probably will need some regulations. In terms of the agricultural sector, I think you're definitely going to need some regulations there. When it comes to land use changes, what have you, um, a difficult area. So I think you're going to need this. What would be best is to get this basket of policies out there. If you were just going to go regulatory, I would certainly say the energy efficiency standards, and you should do a lot for R&D. You could do it that way, right? You could, you could start subsidizing instead of taxing. Production tax credits for renewables, investment tax credits for renewables, things like that. In terms of, I don't know what you do after some of those things if you're really going to be effective. Do you just ban no new drilling for oil, no drilling for gas, no new coal? I guess I haven't really thought enough about that.
Yeah, that's interesting. I'm also thinking of, oh shoot, I think I'm losing my train of thought now. There's just like so much going in my head now. No, it's lost. Sorry.
I do want to thank you for the opportunity to share the report with you folks. So.
That I just remembered it. Okay, so I remember you mentioned one of the assumptions of your report was that other places weren't adopting a carbon tax. And I was curious if, going through this assessment, you got some insight into particular economies that, if they did adopt a carbon tax, would be particularly influential for Hawaii. So like maybe not globally, but at the federal level, if there was a carbon tax, what would that mean for that cost benefit analysis? Or if Japan or other, um, economic players in Hawaii made that decision instead of maybe like a global movement, but if key nations were to adopt a federal or carbon tax, how influential would that be on Hawaii's communities?
So I think I'll say for if there were a national carbon price that were put in place in Hawaii, then just disbanded with its carbon pricing policy. But if it were similar to the carbon fee and dividend mentioned here, where all the revenues go back to households in equal shares, or each citizen gets an equal share, I would think Hawaii would come out fairly well because our energy consumption per capita is lower than the nation on average. So I think we should certainly be, in the near term, it's something we should be pushing our lawmakers. A national carbon price would be, on average, to the benefit of us in Hawaii. In terms of if different nations, depending on if it were major trading partners of Hawaii, especially to whom we export, that could certainly, well, I guess it depends which way it goes. If it's to where we export, would reduce the economic impact to us, because now these places are paying higher prices for goods. So the fact that our prices went up shouldn't really hurt our industries. If it's countries from which we import, that will hurt households some. because now households where they could have substituted away from the domestically produced goods, Hawaii produced goods, to imports. Now, when they move to the imports, that they're not going to be as likely to move away from the imports. So they're not going to be able to shield themselves from the cost increase as easily. So could actually have a, a bit of a negative impact. Done on a global basis where, again, at least within the nation, within the US, that it goes back to Hawaii. I would still think in the near term, Hawaii would probably benefit.
That's very interesting. Well, I'm definitely looking forward to the next wave of carbon fee and dividend or carbon tax bills. And that's another thing. Sometimes I've been hearing people say like it's not a carbon tax, it's a carbon fee. And kind of how our policymakers are understanding, maybe at a semantics level, what these policy propositions are. And yeah, so just like, I think that aspect of it is also something I'd like to learn more about. But yeah, thank you again so much. And for those attending asynchronously and for those here, our next meeting will be, it's always the second Sunday of the month, normally at 4 p.m. And that will be April 11th. And so hopefully I'll see everyone then. And then there's the newsletter to look out for. And Paul, my newsletter will probably involve notes and takeaways from your presentation today and our discussion. And so I'll forward that to you.
Okay, great.
But yeah, thank you again so much.
Sure. Take care.
Yeah. All right. Have a good Sunday afternoon, evening, everyone.
Bye-bye.